So we can start with, what does wildlife mean for you?
Okay. Wildlife for me is that component of the biodiversity which comprises Africa's really iconic species, the larger mammals and maybe the ostrich. They're the species which the communities and the people in Africa consider to be really part of their cultural heritage and part of the big picture of their environment. And it's the species which people from overseas like to come to Africa to see. And it's also those species which are the biggest contributions to the wildlife economy in parts of Africa.
And for you growing up in Africa, spending your life in Africa, and how much has wildlife been a part of your kind of consciousness, but also perhaps economy? What do you think the value of wildlife is for you?
Well, wildlife really inspired me from a very young age, and I wanted to go into wildlife conservation, which I did. So from an early age, I was out bird watching and looking at the plants and looking for the mammals, going to the local provincial nature parks and the national parks. The wildlife was really a part of my life and part of the life of many people living in Africa, particularly those in the rural parts. So I grew up on a farm, and we had wildlife on the farm, and it was part of the farming process, and you farmed to look after wildlife, and in some farms in the area to use wildlife as part of the economy of that area. And so when I went to university, my studies were all around wildlife. In those days, there weren't detailed focal studies, so it was subjects such as zoology, botany, biochemistry, and those sorts of related subjects.
So you actually grew up then, if I understand, with a kind of mixed farming upbringing?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. How has your perception of wildlife changed or not from when you're growing up to now? How has the value of wildlife shifted or changed in any way?
Yes. Well, I grew up on a freehold private commercial farm. And after spending years working in places like Lesotho, KwaZulu-Natal, and Namibia, there was an obvious gap between the rights that the commercial freehold farmers had around their wildlife and the wildlife economy and the opportunities around that, to the situation faced by the communal farmers or the tribal lands of Southern Africa and Africa. On the private land, people had rights over their wildlife. They could develop wildlife economies around tourism, meat production, hunting, and so on. And in the communal areas, that wasn't the case. So people were actually cut off from their resource, which historically had been a very important part of their culture. In the past, the chiefs oversaw hunting, and they oversaw conservation management. They'd close certain areas, open certain areas, put in place certain restrictions on how many of a particular species could be taken or which species could be taken. And so wildlife was historically very much a part of people's culture and their livelihoods. And with colonialism, and particularly also apartheid imposed on countries like Namibia from South Africa, those opportunities were totally closed. A Eurocentric approach was imposed on people in terms of rights over wildlife. Those rights were taken away from people and from chiefs and held by the state, and there was no use of wildlife. The result of that, of course, was that people saw no value in the wildlife. It was just competing with their livestock. It was causing trouble on their land. The elephants were raiding their crops, buffalo, hippo, and so on. The predators were taking their cattle and their goats and sheep, and wildlife had no value whatsoever. So there was really a nationwide and almost an African-wide revolt quietly against that, where people were poaching and just using what wildlife they could when they could. Essentially a tragedy of the commons. And the government was in no position to control that. And in many countries around Africa, that remains the situation today. Government doesn't have the resources to prevent the bushmeat trade, poaching and trade in wildlife, and the people on the ground don't have formalized access to the wildlife and no incentive to manage it in a sustainable way. And that's where large parts of southern Africa have changed the whole picture on wildlife management and turned the whole problem around in those countries.
So if you can cast your mind back to, say, 1950, what was the situation like in Namibia, or 1900? What was the situation like in terms of wildlife and how people related to it?
Yeah. Well, when the first Westerners came into what is today Namibia, crossing the Orange River from the Cape, the wildlife population in Namibia then, we estimate, to be in the order of 8 to 10 million head of wildlife. So it was a huge population of wildlife, diverse wildlife, right across the country, from the most arid areas, the south and the Namib, right through to the high rainfall areas along the Zambezi and Okavango rivers. With the introduction of the early Westerners and their horses and firearms and trading for cattle to take down to the Cape to provision the ships going to the east, firearms and horses were traded. The hunters, the early Westerners themselves, hunted as if there was no end to the wildlife, and we started to see a severe decline in wildlife across Namibia. In the past, people had hunted using their traditional methods, which were sustainable. The offtakes of wildlife were low, but as soon as guns and horses were introduced, that changed significantly. This was followed up by also the ivory trade, where elephants were pursued right across the country, with the ivory being taken down to the Cape or out of Walvis Bay and shipped to various countries in Europe. And then after that, the settlers, mainly from Germany, came in and introduced very Eurocentric farming practices, which were totally out of sync with the ecosystems of these arid and semi-arid environments. Dividing the land into small farms of 3, 4, 5, 6,000 hectares, fencing the land off, putting cattle on there, living on that land, and then, of course, having to deal with diseases such as rinderpest and others coming down. And as a result, the veterinary work at the time setting out to eliminate particular species like wildebeest, blue wildebeest, and buffalo, and so on. The fences, of course, had a devastating effect on the wildlife because in these arid zones with very little surface water, the most important adaptation to aridity is the ability to move. Mobility of moving from patch to patch, where to find nutrients, to find food, to find water. You fence an area off and you've denied the animals that mobility. And so we had crash after crash of wildlife in Namibia. At that stage, the state still exercised ownership over the wildlife. And in the 1960s, we went into quite a serious drought. The freehold farmers who had wildlife on their land were seeing the wildlife competing with their livestock for very, very limited grazing and browsing resources. And they went to the government to say, listen, you own this wildlife, it's your wildlife, you don't let us own it, but it's eating our grass. So please take your wildlife off our land, we don't want it. And in those days, when farms were for sale, if the farm said wildlife free or game free, you got a better price for your farm. Of course, that's changed totally today. So the government at that time said, well, we need to do something about this, otherwise we're going to lose all the wildlife in Namibia. And so they said, let us give provisional rights over the wildlife to commercial farmers who've got surveyed pieces of land, their farms are surveyed. We will change the legislation to alienate ownership from the state to those people so they can build a wildlife economy around that wildlife. And in the late 1960s, the legislation was changed and farmers were given provisional ownership over wildlife. That one administrative move, legal move, essentially changed the whole wildlife industry in Namibia. At that stage, the wildlife from the 8 to 10 million had declined down to about 500,000 head of wildlife in Namibia. And from that point onwards, the wildlife started to increase.
Why was that?
Because farmers saw value in the wildlife. They could now set up tourism businesses and on their farms and drive a tourism industry. They could bring in hunters to hunt some of the wildlife. They could harvest some of the wildlife for meat. and they could also capture surplus animals and put them on live game auctions and sell them to other farmers who now wanted to expand their wildlife economy. The combination of those four components of the wildlife economy, tourism, hunting, meat production, and live sale of animals, resulted in the whole wildlife economy turning around and wildlife becoming 4 to 6 times more productive in terms of returns per hectare than their cattle and sheep and goat industries. And it's those market forces which drove a total reform in Namibia on the freehold commercial farmland. And today we have about 3 million head of wildlife, a 6-fold increase over that low point many years ago, and the wildlife continues to grow. Now, up until independence in Namibia in 1990, those rights over wildlife were just in the hands of the freehold farmers, which meant at that time the white farmers, the settlers essentially. The communal farmlands, communal farmers in their traditional areas had no rights over the wildlife. It's still retained in the state. And after independence, we looked at putting that right to give communal farmers exactly the same rights as the freehold farmers had got. But we needed a different mechanism to do it. Though their land wasn't surveyed and marked out as individual farms, it was open access, huge areas of open land where the various villages were located, and there was commonage and there were crop fields and so on in their areas. And so the mechanism we used, we passed a piece of legislation which said that people can self-identify their areas that they want to work together on to set up what we've called a conservancy. And these conservancies range from about 25 to 30,000 hectares in the higher rainfall areas, such as where we are here, up in the Zambezi region, to over or almost 1 million hectares in some of the drier areas of the country. And the boundaries are set. There's a constitution, a committee is elected, a benefit distribution and a wildlife management plan are both put in place. And then once that's in place and the government has satisfied itself that the vast majority of people in that area want to form a conservancy, want to take over the rights to manage sustainably and benefit from wildlife, then that conservancy is approved and it's published in the government gazette with its name and boundaries and its committee, and it becomes a legal entity which gets exactly the same rights as the freehold farmers had. So that then results in the Conservancy appointing their own game guards, entering into joint venture agreements with professional hunters who bring hunters in from overseas, developing lodges such as where we are sitting today. This is one of the lodges in a conservancy, and having these joint venture arrangements with the private sector on realizing a wildlife economy in this area. The staff, the game guards, carry out game counts, and every year there's an annual game count which is coordinated together with the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, the government agency, the support NGOs, and often the private sector partners together with the community and the game guards. And those counts determine what the quota will be, the sustainable off-takes will be, and then people decide how to use those off-takes in terms of the best economic returns which they can get. So for example, there are species in this country which have high value as live sale. Their value is far higher as a live animal than its protein meat value would be if it just went through the abattoir. So, and a good example of that is a black-faced impala. It's an endemic subspecies to Namibia, and it's quite rare, and people will pay 15 to 18,000 Namibian dollars for a live animal. The actual meat value would probably be in the order of 3,000 or 4,000. So when you make these decisions, you say, right, how can I optimize my return from sustainable offtake? This program has resulted in 86 conservancies being formed in Namibia. More than half of the communal areas in Namibia are now managed as conservancies. About 250,000 people are members of these conservancies and benefits at the household level and at the institutional level. And the return of wildlife has been dramatic in many areas. So, when we look at all of this, and this type of approach which I'm describing now is a uniquely Southern African approach. It's something that's been done in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana is doing it, Mozambique is now rolling it out, Angola is interested in following suit, Zambia is involved with it, but it's different from the way that much of the rest of Africa has approached conservation. Southern Africa has approached conservation from a fairly hard-nosed wildlife economy point of view, linked to rural people's livelihoods. Those two elements are fundamentally important. If people get benefit from wildlife, they will want wildlife. If people get benefit from wildlife, they're much more prepared to put up with the problems that wildlife creates, such as lions and crocodiles taking their livestock, such as elephants, hippos, buffalo and other species raiding their crop fields, such as elephants breaking their water points down. If they know that these animals also generate benefits, then they are much more prepared to live with them and find better and better solutions to deal with the problems and the costs associated with it. And in that way, we've used the economy of wildlife to create a wildlife program in Africa and integrate wildlife into the core economies right across the country. And that's been the difference between Namibia and Southern Africa and much of the rest of Africa.
If you think of the wildlife economy, I don't know if you can give me any indication of what is the proportions or rough estimates of the 4 different types of major income streams, and specifically what would be the kind of contribution hunting would give to the overall economy? What kind of proportions are we talking about?
Well, let's look at this conservancy we're in at the moment. We're sitting in a conservancy of about 30,000 hectares on the banks of the Kwandu River. Across the river is the Bobwata National Park, and this is the biggest lodge in that conservancy, but there are 2 other lodges and 2 campsites. Those tourism establishments contribute about half the income to this conservancy, and this conservancy also has a joint venture with a professional hunter. And that professional hunter brings in hunters from overseas to hunt elephant, hippo, leopard, and a number of ungulates such as kudu and lechwe and so on. That hunting package brings in about half the income, and these lodges and tourism operations bring in about the other half. There's a small contribution from a craft market nearby and a cultural village. There's a small contribution from various other enterprises in the area. This particular area, because we're far away from markets in the rest of the country, there hasn't been much in the way of live sale of wildlife. Partly because they're still building up their wildlife to meet the higher levels of offtake. But the other very important thing about the hunting, in addition to half the cash coming in, there's also an in-kind contribution. And that in-kind contribution is the meat. So when all the animals are shot by the hunters, the meat, as part of the contract of the professional hunter, gets distributed to the villages in the area. And that is something which is highly treasured and appreciated by the community, the distribution of game meat into their area. Some conservancies, in addition to their hunting quota for professional hunting, also do a self-hunt, a cropping operation where they hunt for meat, which is distributed to their members. But again, similar to the live sale and the meat value, the hunting value of an animal is many, many times higher than the meat value. But we take off only a very small proportion of animals for trophy hunting. So of Namibia's just over 3 million head of wildlife, only 1% is taken off for the trophy industry, and the rest is taken off mainly for the meat sector. Now, the reason that all of this meat is taken off, all these animals are taken off, is because the wildlife populations are growing at 25 to 35% per year. And if we didn't take animals off, there would be an ecological disaster in terms of overgrazing and so on. I think it's also important to step back for a minute and just look at the land uses that we're talking about here. In Namibia, for example, just under 18% of our land area is set aside in national parks. As you see across the river there, that national park is absolutely natural habitat. It's habitat as existed 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. It's not influenced in any significant way by humans. So it's really proper natural environments that we protect in our protected areas. It's not sort of manipulated, managed farmlands for a little beetle bank or a bit of this or a bit of that. It's open, huge open areas of natural vegetation, natural ecosystems, and natural processes taking place, both ecological processes and evolutionary processes. That's the quality of our protected areas here. And that covers about 18% of the country. From the high rainfall areas such as this, where we're getting about 600, 650 millimeters on average per year, to the low rainfall areas in the Namib, where it's only about 50 millimeters. Outside of that is farmland. The towns are very small. They occupy less than 1% of the country. But outside of that is farmland. And so farmers can essentially choose how they want to run their land. They don't have to have wildlife on their land. They can say, look, wildlife doesn't work for us. Elephants on our land just don't work for us. Having lions on our land and our cattle and so on doesn't work for us. It's like asking the population, the farmers in the UK, to carry wolves on their land, and the sheep farmers to have lynx on their land. Those farmers say, listen chaps, this really doesn't work for us. We are farming and these things are not compatible. Exactly the same here. These farmers are farming with maize, pearl millet, cattle, sheep, goats, and to farm with those types of animals is very, very difficult. But with these incentives, farmers are prepared to do it because they're getting benefits from it. They're getting significant benefits from it. By undermining these benefits, we're reducing people's willingness to live with wildlife, to have wildlife, to include wildlife in their economies. And people will just say, look, let's get rid of it. In Namibia today, over 80% of the wildlife in this country is not in our national parks. It's on our private land and on our communal land. That has been the success of this program. And that delivers not just the wildlife, the mammals and so on, it also delivers protection of natural ecosystems, natural vegetation, and by collateral benefits is all the other biodiversity that lives there. Other benefits include the connectivity across the landscape. So we don't have our parks as little isolated islands with high conflict areas around them, as in much of Africa, where you're defending that park, you're stopping people coming in and cutting the timber, you're stopping people coming in and poaching. We don't have that problem because around all of our parks are people using and engaging with their wildlife. And they see the park as a benefit because the park is exporting wildlife, keeps a lot of the genetic resources there, exports the wildlife, creates opportunities for them to have tourism lodges just outside the park with concession areas given to them by the national parks for them to take their tourists into the park. And they see these parks as real economic benefits to them. The wildlife is being used, the park is being used, they are integrated into that landscape, and they are part of the wildlife economy. And after all, wildlife is very much part of people's cultural heritage in Africa. And they see it as a resource in the same way as people in the Northern Hemisphere see herring, cod, and other species there as a resource which they utilize. This is part of Africa's resource. It's part of the economy of the place, it's part of the culture of the place, and it's part of people's livelihoods. The fact that we can keep the majority of our wildlife outside of national parks, prospering, being sustainably used, growing, being part of ecosystem services is a remarkable, absolutely globally remarkable achievement. And things which undermine that are undermining really something remarkable, something which most places in the rest of the world haven't achieved and unfortunately don't fully understand and appreciate.
We're here, I think, in the, not the edge, but our side of the Kavango-Zambezi Greater Conservation Area. This is a trans-frontier park. It's quite remarkable that wildlife and conservation created the understanding between countries to then create a bigger park based purely on wildlife, you know, and tourism and opportunities around that. So doesn't that prove then that it can be a catalyst for really radical transformations? And I was wondering if CASA represents anything to you in terms of the wildlife economy in the broadest sense.
We're sitting in a trans-frontier conservation area, which is a collaboration between 5 countries. It's the Kavango-Zambezi Trans-Frontier Area, and we call it CASA for short. The 5 countries involved are Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia. And this corner of the Zambezi region in Namibia, what used to be the Caprivi, known as the Caprivi Strip, those 5 countries have one of the largest sets of wildlife resources anywhere in Africa. This area alone has about 300,000 elephants shared between those countries. It has wild dog populations, it has healthy lion populations, and it's a mosaic landscape of protected areas, farmland, conservancies, forestry reserves, community forests, and community fish reserves, where communities are managing all these resources in sustainable ways for their benefit. So it's really a wildlife and natural resource economy, and the recognition of that by these southern African countries who've been doing this type of work and looking at wildlife as a valuable asset. In fact, Africa's probably one of Africa's biggest globally competitive comparative economic advantages. It's that group that came together to say that why don't we work collectively to further optimize the opportunities that this wildlife can give us. And those opportunities are around increasing the potential for hunting in this area, increasing the potential for tourism, trying to break down the problems of crossing borders for tourists coming in. Once you've come into the area, you can move around the whole area. But also looking at joint management of wildlife, how we can teach and learn from each other across the region, how we can monitor across the region, how we can do anti-poaching across the region, and how we can really make this a vibrant wildlife economy. Now, the important thing here is what comes first. And in our experience and over many years of working with communities and private farmers and so on, it's very clear that what comes first is developing a vibrant wildlife economy for the benefit of people. And when that is working and really firing up and humming, the conservation benefits ensue. You generate huge conservation benefits as a result. Don't approach it as a conservation initiative because it's soft and fluffy. Approach it as a hard-nosed economic business approach with people at the heart of it. They're the beneficiaries. When they do well from the wildlife, they look after the wildlife. You get numbers increasing, ranges of species increasing, poaching going down, a vibrant wildlife-based economy with everything that goes with that, the forests and the vegetation and all the other components of the biodiversity. And that's been our experience very much. It's complicated, having 5 countries working together, and it's sometimes a little bit slow, but the benefits are huge. And one of the big things that we did recently was doing a CASA-wide elephant survey. So we had aircrafts in the air. They flew the equivalent of 1.5 times around the globe in terms of the area they covered. Very intensive in all the countries, and we got an elephant population estimate of about 300,000 elephants, 296,000 I think it was exactly, and that showed a healthy increase on previous counts which had been done some 10 years ago. We see that across most countries, real increases in these populations. In Namibia, for example, at the time of Namibia's independence, in 1990, we had 7,000 elephants. Today, we've got just over 24,000 elephants in the country, most of which occur up in the Kaza region here. About 19,000 occur in this Kaza region. So these countries are doing very well in terms of conservation and management, and the approach that's adopted in Southern Africa is really delivering conservation outcomes by focusing on economy and people, and the outcomes flow. So you may ask, why is Southern Africa doing so well with the utilization policy, actually using wildlife in various ways, compared to other parts of Africa where they don't formally use the wildlife, parts of West Africa and so on, who've lost most of their wildlife. And they've never done trophy hunting there, but they've lost most of their wildlife. And a lot of people say to us, well, you do trophy hunting and offtake because you've got a lot of wildlife. We say, no, you don't understand. We've got a lot of wildlife because we do trophy hunting and other forms of utilization and tourism. It's the economy that drives a lot of wildlife. So there are a couple of conditions that you need to have in place to make a wildlife a success, particularly outside of national parks, but also in national parks, so the parks aren't surrounded by enemies and there's continual encroachment and destroying the resources that are in there. People have to value their national parks, and so they have to get something significant out of them. And the conditions that you need are, firstly, people have to have rights over the resource. So they've got an interest in managing them and looking after those resources. In Namibia, for example, we've got the only population of rhino, black rhino, living amongst communities, a large population living amongst communities. It's the population that has had the least poaching. We haven't lost a single rhino there in the last 4 or 5 years. And the reason is that the communities are looking after it. It's their rhino. They're getting benefits from those rhino. They're getting benefits through tourism and odd hunting. The odd animal that's taken off is an old bull that's now causing problems and attacking and killing young bulls. Those get taken off and the money comes back into conservation, into management. So you've got to have rights over your resources. If you don't have those rights, then it's open common property, and then you have the bushmeat, no one looks after, everyone takes whatever they can. The second thing you have to have in place is a wildlife economy. So you can actually trade, so you can actually create value for the meats. You can create value in formal markets, not selling it under price on the side of the road, but have proper formal markets. You can engage with the trophy hunting sector, you can engage with live sale of surplus high value species and so on. So you have to have a vibrant wildlife economy that's operating, so that the people who own the wildlife and have rights over it and are managing it wisely can realize the value. And the third thing you need is the right policy environment and government engagement that is investing in the wildlife sector, investing in anti-poaching when it comes to some of these high-level poachings, Asia putting pressure on rhino horn and ivory, and which is essentially stealing from the people and trying to get these out. And you have to have government engagement at that level with proper law enforcement, connecting the police, the Ministry of Environment and Tourism Agency, the Prosecutor's Office, Customs and Excise, bringing them all together to work effectively. When you've got those three elements in place, then you've got a functioning wildlife economy and people on the ground benefiting, and you've got a stable and increasing wildlife populations across the country. That's what we have in Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and so on. Those conditions are not in place in much of the rest of Africa. They're not in place at all. And most of those countries don't do trophy hunting anyway. So closing putting a hunting ban on and closing imports of trophies does nothing to those states which have essentially failed when it comes to wildlife. But it undermines the successful states which are putting money back into their wildlife economy. Now, a lot of people, particularly in urban Western society, will say it's counterintuitive to use wildlife to protect wildlife. We need to protect wildlife to protect wildlife. If you apply that same thinking to a farming situation, if you protect the cattle on the farms and say we're going to close down the abattoir, what's going to happen? You're closing down the markets. So farmers are going to say, well, we don't want these cows on our land. We're going to use our land for something entirely different. You're not going to have more cows as a result of closing down the abattoir. You will have more cows as a result of increasing the demand for meat. Closing the factories down will result in farmers saying, right, we have to get rid of these animals, we can't market them, there's no value to them. Exactly the same has happened in the cart horse, to the cart horse on farms in Europe. As soon as the tractor was introduced, the cart horse had no value. It was just eating grass and didn't have a function. So the cart horse numbers across Europe declined and declined, and they're so rare now that you have to have special groups looking after the few remaining breeds of cart horse. You can apply exactly the same thing to a commercial outlet, like a shop. You've got a big shop, supermarket somewhere. If you don't have a functioning way of taking the groceries off the shelf and paying for them, and that money being used to restock the groceries, things won't work. So by closing down the sale of the goods on the shelf won't mean that your system will function any better. So it's actually not counterintuitive at all. It's very logical. And if all of these elements are not in place, so if farmers don't have rights over the land that they're using to farm their cattle, and they don't have rights over the cattle, they can't operate. If there aren't markets for the cattle, they can't operate. If the government isn't creating a supportive system and a level playing field and stopping people stealing their cows, it won't operate. The other point that people often raise is that there's no real difference between killing an animal under a trophy hunt and poaching. The animal's dead at the end of the day. Sure, the animal is dead. But the conditions of how that operates are profoundly different. It's like comparing someone shoplifting and someone buying those goods off the shelf. The goods are off the shelf, both cases. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is if you buy the goods, you're reinvesting in the business. People can restock that shelf. They can control their stock flow and what's happening. They can manage a situation. They can employ staff. They can create an economy. If they're stealing, they're undermining the economy. And it's the same with stock theft and formal production and poaching and the wildlife economy. So one needs to clarify one's thinking around these areas and really understand how the incentives work and how everything hangs together. I think one of the things that we also need to talk about and unpack is the whole issue of ethics and animal welfare situations. I think those are really important. We've got a number of different situations which we can look at. On the one hand, we've got the domestic stock going to the abattoir, often being raised under very unpleasant factory farming conditions. They're raised under variable conditions, some better, some abhorrent. They get put on a truck and they get taken to an abattoir where they get slaughtered. Now, that process is not visually available to most people. And most people go to the supermarket and they see their nice little packaged set of sausages and their nice roast leg of lamb and their bacon, all nicely sanitized and packaged there. They never see that process. That process is a very unpleasant process. I stopped eating meat at the age of 11 or 12 because I didn't want to be part of that factory farming process, because I think ethically it is problematic. I don't want to be associated with it. On the other hand, hunting takes place out in the environment where the animals are. Essentially, the abattoir goes to the animal. In the abattoir with the livestock, most of the time the animals go through, they have a stun gun, there's a humane killer that knocks them out, the throat is cut, they bled, they're pulled up, and they're butchered. Anyone watching that would not enjoy it unless they're pathologically unstable. No one would enjoy that. But these animals are taken off. It's part of the farming process. It's part of food production. It's part of feeding the world. your community, my community, all over the place. When it comes to hunting, the hunter goes to the animal. And in most cases, that animal is killed quickly and swiftly. Not every time. Sometimes the animal is wounded and has to be followed up and then is killed. Similar to the abattoir, sometimes that humane killer doesn't drop the animal and there's problems in the death process. It's unpleasant. We don't like it. The whole effort and emphasis is on animal ethics and making sure that animal welfare is very high on the list. But the condition of a factory farm and transport and going to the abattoir and everything those animals go through is at a totally different level to what the animals in the veld with a hunt go through. It's generally they're out there, they don't even know the hunter's there, it's quick, they drop, and that's it. And to me, that is a far more ethical way of killing animals where animals have to be taken off anyway. We have to remove 25 to 35% of our animals. We can get a professional person to go and cull them and put the meat into the sector, or we can make 30 to 40 times more by having a hunter come out and take that one animal under the guidance of a professional hunter who also is there to help. If the hunter doesn't drop the animal immediately, he will shoot and take the animal and drop it. So it's generally a very clean, quick process, and the time that the wild animal is subject to any welfare issues is very minuscule compared to what the domestic stock have to go through. Now, when there's poaching, it's not nearly as clean as that. There's no professionalism in it. Often there's snares, animals lie for days and days, and that's why it's so important to get the illegal get the poaching out of the system, not only from the business point of view and the wildlife economy and the conservation point of view, but also because of the animal ethics and animal welfare point of view. So when you put them all on the table and you look at them, the quality of ethics that are applied to hunting is far, far higher and far more acceptable to me in terms of animal welfare than what happens on many farms. Not all. Some farmers are very particular and look after their animals, and some countries are much better than others. But ultimately, factory farming, the way pigs are kept in small containers, all the hormones that are put into animals, all the little boxes in which chickens have to spend their lives, they can't move around, that is for me abhorrent. What happens in the hunting sector is at a totally different level and far more ethical at every turn.
The other thing is because of these wildlife natural growth rate, the population of wildlife is high. I didn't realize it was 25-35% per annum. We have to do offtake anyway because of the population growth. Others, they've destroyed the environment they live in. You have to do offtake. So how do you do it?
On a conservancy such as this, or on a private farm, with the wildlife increasing at 25 to 35 and sometimes even more % per year, to maintain that land in good ecological condition, we need to take the animals off. So say, for example, we've done our game counts and we need to take off 50 oryx. Of those oryx, perhaps 4 or 5 would qualify as trophy animals. The rest would need to be taken off and put into the meat industry and the skin industry. Those 5 animals, with a hunter coming in, accommodation, guiding, and all the rest of the support services that go to support this hunting industry, would generate in the order of $80,000 to $90,000 per animal. The animals which are going into the meat sector would generate between $4,000 to $6,000 per animal. So when people are looking at the economy, they're obviously always looking to see how they can optimize their returns. But not all the animals are trophy quality animals. So in the whole of Namibia, over our 3 million, just over 3 million head of wildlife, on average only 1% of all those animals are taken off every year as trophy. The rest go into the meat sector, and a few of them go onto the live sale markets and are traded as live animals, to restock new areas, sometimes bought from places outside the country, sometimes swapped with neighboring countries. One type of wildlife for another, where we are short of wildlife and they've got surplus, we will swap out wildlife. This happened recently between South Africa and Namibia, where we gave them some rhino and they gave us some buffalo. Similarly, similar exchanges had taken place with Zambia, where we got some waterbuck from them and we gave them some of our species that they were low on in return. So this is all part of very much a conservation, biodiversity driven component, as well as an economic component to wildlife management as a resource across the region.
What would you like to say to the countries who want to ban the import of trophies, lobby against hunting in southern Africa? What would you like to say to those Western countries thinking about these things?
There are a number of countries around the world, mainly in Western Europe, who find hunting and trophy hunting abhorrent. They don't like it. It's mainly the urban Western societies that are quite far removed from their food production systems that think that trophy hunting is an unpleasant business. And they may be right. They may be right. But so is their meat going through their abattoirs even more unpleasant. The situation is, any attempt to introduce bans on trophy hunting and imports of trophies into these countries, those concepts are very misguided. Because the countries that don't manage their wildlife well, are not invested in their wildlife, don't have the right policies in their wildlife sectors for management, they don't do trophy hunting anyway. And trophy hunting is not a part of their economy, so they're not saving anything there. Those countries are failed wildlife states because they haven't devolved wildlife to local people to look after, because they haven't set up a wildlife economy, and because the governments, not earning anything from wildlife and seeing wildlife as a valuable resource, don't have a budget, any significant budget to look after their wildlife. So those conditions, no matter what you do, those are internal conditions to those countries. And external factors such as CITES and the CBD and looking at preventing trade and preventing hunting of these species really has no effect on those countries, because they are wildlife states which have failed. Those wildlife states which have not failed, which are really got stable and increasing populations of wildlife, are in that condition because they have devolved rights to people on the ground, because they have a wildlife economy, and because they have their governments deeply invested in the wildlife sector in terms of staff allocation and budgets and anti-poaching work and so on. Those are successful states. Their wildlife is increasing, and what any ban is doing is actually challenging the integrity and the sovereignty of those states to successfully manage their wildlife, and undermining the ability to do so, but also undermining the livelihoods of rural people, significantly undermining the livelihoods of rural people who have made huge commitments and sacrifices to build up their wildlife populations, live with those wildlife species which are difficult to live with, and then derive income for their livelihoods from those species. So the impact is not only a conservation impact, but it's also a people impact, people's livelihood impact, undermining a sector of society which is really using their natural heritage, their natural and cultural heritage in a sustainable way for their benefits. It's particularly ironic that some of these countries feel that they can impose on these successful states their own ideology under the guise of working for conservation. Most of the time, it's political responses hoping to get a few extra votes in a cynical way, because most of the politicians know that by stopping import of trophies, they're not having any impact on the negative countries, but they're actually undermining those countries that are doing well. If you take the UK, for example, the UK in recent modern human history, from the 1600s onwards, at the time that the UK was supporting a huge slave trade industry in Africa, linked to an ivory trade. 6 million odd slaves were taken, and huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of elephants were slaughtered. The slaves went to the New World, the ivory went to the Old World through UK and elsewhere. That process reduced the elephants in southern Africa to fewer than 10,000 elephants south of the Zambezi and south of the Cunene. When the UK stopped its slave trade in 1800, we had fewer than 10,000 elephants here. Since then, we've rebuilt that population to over 300,000 elephants without any help from the Western countries in terms of banning and stopping and limiting. We've rebuilt that population. Namibia's population at independence was 7,000 elephants. We've rebuilt it up to 24,000 elephants and growing. At that time, the UK had lost its elk, its wolf, its bear, and a number of other species, such as the beaver, which they're just starting to get back now. The UK has done nothing to re-establish their historic wildlife populations as free-ranging. I'm not talking about cages and little containers, they're boar. They've done nothing to reintroduce and re-establish those species as free-ranging species, as our wildlife here is in Africa, free-ranging species, not behind fences. And they know they can't do it because their farmers wouldn't allow them to do it. We found ways of having our farmers live with species which are 20 times more difficult than a little wolf and a little lynx and a couple of bears and a boar. Those are domestic pets compared to lion, elephant, hippo, crocodile, leopard, wild dog, cheetah. I mean, we're talking, and our farmers are living with them. And they continue to be happy to live with them if they get benefits from it. And those countries in Europe are undermining that benefit flow and trying to break the systems here which work so well. Another thing which is fairly ironic is that some of these southern African countries are the top-rated countries in international publications, scientifically based, evidence-led publications, on their ability to manage megafauna. Botswana is rated number 1, Namibia is rated number 2, Zambia and Zimbabwe are right up there in the top 10, and so on. The UK, as an example, is rated 132nd in the world in terms of its megafaunal conservation management and successes. And country 132 is trying to tell countries 1, 2, 5, 8 and 10 in terms of their ability to manage megafauna, how to do it, and put trade restrictions actually to impose their failed ideology on southern Africa. There's an irony in that. And there's also, it's more than an irony. It's an ego thinking of their own views and their own abilities in the world which are not in sync with reality on the ground. These countries need to get real and understand where skills exist in African ecosystems, wildlife management, and it's not in those countries.
I've only got a couple more questions. Is that okay, Chris?
Yeah, keep going.
You're not in a hurry.
This thing's flickering, is that right?
Oh, it's just
Battery's
perfect,
probably...
but I actually changed them this morning. Look, I think...
Well, it won't affect anything, will it?
You look great. I mean, you know...
You're drawing me into more controversial things here. I started off being quite benign.
You can choose to or not. Let's
no, you
continue
go for it. I don't mind.
Good. Okay, let's think about climate change, adaptation, aridity. You know, the world's changing for many reasons, but one of the fastest things zooming towards us over the horizon. We can see the fire, but we can't smell the smoke. Climate change is happening. It's coming towards us. We're heating up. We're drying out. The statistics are there. We can use your graph from yesterday and a few others. How is wildlife going to support Namibia's rural economies in the future? And why do you think wildlife is best as a land use for many, many people? And how does wildlife, again, just to key the stone in, wildlife is at the bedrock of that? Excuse me. Okay.
Another really important aspect of Namibia's wildlife economy is its role in the issue of climate adaptation for Southern Africa, for Namibia, for these dryland areas. Namibia, as an example, is heating up faster than the global average. We are already over 1.5 degrees hotter than we were in 1920. And that has a huge effect on our production systems. One of the things about these arid zones is that we're at the margins of a lot of different production systems. So rain-fed cropping occurs up in the north of Namibia, down to about 400 millimeter ISO height. Large stock farming is economically viable down to about 300 millimeter ISO height. Small stock farming, sheep and goats, is viable down to about 120 to 150 millimeters of rainfall. And we've already seen areas south of that going bankrupt, the farms don't work, so people are turning that over to wildlife and tourism. Now, with climate change, we've modeled the effects that climate change will have on Namibia, and they're essentially driving those rainfall ISO heights north and east. So more and more of the country is becoming uneconomical under dryland rain-fed cropping, under large stock farming, and under small stock farming. By 2038, 2040, we will have lost about 9 million hectares of land, which is currently marginally economically viable under large stock. And by about 2065, we will have lost more than another 9 million. So almost 20 million hectares of land will be lost to large stock farming. Crop farming will essentially be pushed right out of Namibia. It'll no longer, even arid zone crops like pearl millet won't be viable in Namibia. Small stock farming will also have lost about 25 million hectares of land, which will no longer be viable. What are we going to do? Much of the talk has been on small scale types of interventions, stuff that the United Nations brings, catching a little bit of rain off your roof, these little petty things, sort of deck chairs on the Titanic. There hasn't been real strategic assessment of what the future holds and how we can manage. One of the areas that holds huge possibility, probably the only one, is Namibia's wildlife. Pre-adapted to arid and hyper-arid conditions, if we really upscale our wildlife economies at many levels, that will more than replace the existing production systems. So wildlife and the wildlife economy is...
I'm interrupting. When you say production systems, can we say farming, or is that too general?
No, I think we can say farming.
Can I ask you to use the word farming, because then people get it. Sorry.
Yeah. Where was I?
You were saying that, we're pre-adapted. If wildlife can actually take over at least, if not more, than farming as it exists today. That's where we were.
So wildlife offers an opportunity to really replace a lot of what is land under farming at the moment. The wildlife is pre-adapted to arid conditions, is more productive than farming in Namibia, creates greater opportunities, and we can grow this wildlife economy in many ways by just doing a few simple things, by promoting a landscape approach to it, by being much more effective and competitive in the way it's done, by opening up new markets to the other parts of the world, particularly the Asian side of the world. The more that the Western urban society tries to limit our use of wildlife and the development of our wildlife economy, what's really happening is you're pushing us away to spend more and more of our focus on the eastern parts of the globe with Asia. And there's a huge market in Asia. So over time, all those markets are closed, people take themselves out, we can look elsewhere for markets. But what is happening is actually a trade embargo. That's what's actually being undertaken. So if the West embargoes trade with Namibia and Southern Africa, we can retaliate and we can say, well, why do you want our lithium? Why do you want our green hydrogen? why do you want our oil and gas? We don't want to, you limit our ability to sustainably use our own resources just through ideological views on what we should be doing from a nation who has largely failed in its own efforts. So why should we continue to place you in a primary trade position? Let's go elsewhere where people appreciate and understand what we're doing. And we don't need to trade with you on certain things as well. The interesting thing is that a lot of the Western Bloc is working very hard to try and establish good relations with Africa, particularly parts of Southern Africa, to counter the attractions of Africa working with China and Russia. But their macro political agenda is being undermined by their micro wildlife agendas. They're actually, two are working against each other, and those micro wildlife interfering policies which they have are turning Africa away from the West. To say, why do we need to work with you guys that interfere in things which have really not got an awful lot to do with you, and you've got no real expertise in this area? Why don't we work with other countries that understand what we're doing and have a much more quid pro quo approach to proper open trade? So the issue of desertification and the issue of climate change are really important in these arid areas of Southern Africa and other parts of Africa. And wildlife can really play a significant role in helping to maintain the livelihoods of people in these areas. So landscape approaches is one, but also bringing other parts of biodiversity into the production system. There's no reason why we shouldn't be trading with our ivory. There's no reason why we shouldn't be trading with our rhino horn in these areas, because that would hugely increase the returns, the sustainable returns to landowners, to custodians of land, to communities, and increase the whole value of wildlife in these areas and bring all of that into production, which would allow Africa to really capitalize on its global competitive advantage. If these resources were resources of Europe or North America, they would be traded. They would be traded. They wouldn't allow the rest of the world to say, you've got a hugely valuable resource there, but we're not allowing you to trade in it. So these types of restrictions are really undermining communities, livelihoods, conservation, wildlife economies, and the future developments of these parts of the world.
We literally have radio collars, we do surveys, we do censuses, we know where our animals are, we know what they are, and we have traceability. Can you just emphasize the rigid regulations and the literally we know where almost every rhino is, every elephant is, and you can't just go, there's too many checks and balances, there's too many controls from communities to government to, you know, maybe just assure people in the West that we really have a handle on our megafauna.
As part of our wildlife management systems in Namibia and in most of the other countries of Southern Africa, there are very well-established monitoring mechanisms from the community game guards through to the support NGOs, through to government in terms of the management and utilization of this wildlife. So every conservancy employs a number of game guards. Where we are sitting at the moment, in this conservancy on the Kwandu River, there are 16 community game guards that go out every day to monitor what's happening, to go and speak to the villagers, to go through into the veld, into the bush, and look at tracks and spoor. And there's a monitoring system in place. They carry a bag with them and they record all their sightings, they record any incidences, any poaching incidences, whatever's out there. They're recording everything from rainfall through to sightings, sex ratios, age, and so on of these wildlife. That all comes together annually, and it's consolidated within the conservancy with all the game guards, and it's consolidated for each region, and then it's consolidated across the country. So we have not only an idea of what's happening on each sort of 25 to 50,000 hectare patch to $1 million patch, million hectare patch, but we can look at across the whole country as well. On top of that, there are annual game counts, different types of counts in different areas, depending on the conditions there. So in areas where you have San Bushman communities, it's walking trails with loggers linked to GPSs, and they can read the veldt, and they know what the spoor is of every animal. They know the age, sex, and so on, and that's all logged, and that's the way those areas are counted. In more arid areas, there are road counts with vehicles going out. One of the biggest counts in the world takes place here in Namibia, where we count within a period of 3 weeks 7 million hectares of land, with the communities, the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, the support organizations, and some of the private sector partners all doing fixed route road counts, and that all gets brought together. From time to time, in certain areas, there are waterhole counts, 72-hour waterhole counts in arid areas where people sit at all of these waterholes and they count all the water-dependent species coming in to drink, and they can identify the individuals. There are other programs where there are camera traps for species such as leopard and zebra, where you can individually identify animals and work out what those populations are. And then on top of that, there are aerial surveys, fixed wing and helicopter surveys that take place from time to time in different parts of the country.
And radio.
In this part of the country here, for example, every 2 to 3 years, there's a fixed wing and helicopter count on all the wetlands and all the wetland species, counting things such as lechwe, sitatunga, reedbuck, hippo, crocodile, and all the other animals which come down to the water to drink, large numbers of buffalo, elephant, and so on. And then there are programs on special species where these systems don't deliver good counts. So nocturnal species and predators which skulk away, we have national programs to determine the populations of these. We've just done a survey on the leopards of the country. It took 3 years to do, involving everyone, from nature conservation people in national parks, private protected areas, farmers, NGOs, communities, the hunters. Everyone contributed their information through camera traps and through radio transmitters. And we've just completed a study on the cheetah population of Namibia. So these types of projects are important. They all come together to help monitor our wildlife populations. We, from time to time, bring all the specialists together, government specialists, the NGO specialists, to produce state of species condition status in the country. So we've just published the status and red data book on all the carnivores of Namibia, bringing everyone involved that's been working on carnivores for the last 20, 30 or more years. And that publication sets out the population status, the trends, the threats, the actions that are required, and so on. So I think there are very few countries in the world that have the level of wildlife monitoring that Namibia has. And the reason is not because of conservation. The reason is because wildlife is such an important part of our economy. We are monitoring our comparative economic advantage, which is our wildlife, so we're monitoring our natural capital as part of this. And we don't want our natural capital to be undermined or to diminish. We want to grow that natural capital, and therein lies the conservation outcomes that we're looking for. They are dividends, conservation dividends from a wildlife economy which creates value for people on the ground.
And going back to the biodiversity, can we just bring a link that with a mosaic of protected areas across Namibia, and with an understanding of our wildlife within these greater landscapes, isn't biodiversity increasing because, not a default, but the two together go hand in hand?
Yeah.
If you think on a landscape level and you want to grow your wildlife, by definition you're improving or maintaining a biodiversity.
With an emphasis on our wildlife economy, our game numbers, the impact of that is far greater than just on those species, those large mammals that are part of the wildlife economy. Those wild animals, those large game animals, are de facto are protecting the vegetation, the natural vegetation, and all the other parts of biodiversity that are part of that. So they're pulling everything along with them. They are the flagship sectors of the economy which create the protection of everything that goes with them. They're also protecting wetlands, they're protecting ecosystem services, and they're creating connectivity across the country. Because so much land is now under wildlife as a result of these wildlife-based incentives and this wildlife economy. About probably in the order of 70% of Namibia is now managed for wildlife to a greater or lesser extent in formal or less formal ways, driven essentially by market forces. So it doesn't require a huge investment from government or from anyone else. The market is doing it for us. The policy has created the incentives, and the policy is working, and more people are going into the wildlife economy, which protects collaterally so much more of the biodiversity in the country. And this process is continuing to proceed, and more land is coming under wildlife. The older farmers, who typically have grown up all their lives doing cattle or sheep, they are loath to change. They're stuck in their farming practices. That's what they know. They're not comfortable with tourists and so on. But as soon as that land changes hands, their children come in and take over, or the land is sold and new owners come in, you see a change in land use practices, and wildlife plays a bigger and bigger role. So this is something that is happening right across the country. It's being driven by the wildlife economy. It's being driven by the policy framework we have, and it's proving to be extremely good for biodiversity conservation, for the economy, and for the livelihoods of people. In the communal areas of Namibia, more than half of those areas are now under conservancies. On the freehold land, in the order of probably 85% or more have wildlife as part of their economy to a greater or lesser extent. Some are formal hunting farms, some are privately protected areas, some are freehold conservancies, but a lot of the other farms which don't fall into any formal category just have wildlife as part of their production systems. Some of them are doing it full-time, some are doing it in conjunction with their other farming practices, domestic stock, whether it's cattle, sheep or goats. And so wildlife is really, there are very few parts of the country that you can go to and not find wildlife. It's all over the place. People want it, they see it as a valuable asset because it's contributing to their livelihoods and their economy.
It's quite ironic that people who should know better, who've seen our track record over 70 years, we've trusted ourselves. Is it about time you trust us, gave us a break?
The trust which governments have placed in freehold commercial farmers and the trust which the government has placed in communal farmers has more than paid off, in that the people have responded by doing this, that and the other, and such was the level of trust that government has actually taken high-value species out of its national park and put it into communities for the communities to look after, including hugely high-value species such as black rhino. The communities have risen to the occasion. They've looked after and grown those wildlife resources. They've even moved where they live and pulled back their homesteads to open up areas for tourism development along rivers to increase their economy. So there have been huge investments by people, by governments in this, and it's all delivered the outcomes which everyone had hoped for.
Yeah, okay. So basically, we in Namibia have trusted ourselves, and that trust has paid dividends way beyond our wildest dreams. And I guess the future's looking, is it an exponential? Is there a finite limit?
Well, we haven't come anywhere near reaching the potential, both in terms of the wildlife product and in terms of the markets around those wildlife products. This area here, for example, before COVID, when things were knocked back a bit, was earning $4 million per year. This area could be earning $10, $12, $15 million a year. Continuing to grow the wildlife resource and continuing to expand the business opportunities and realizing the full value of those business opportunities will hugely increase the wildlife economy in this area. That's before you've brought in things such as ivory and rhino horn and so on into production. Just what's here at the moment.
Great, Chris. Thanks, man.